It's doscember! Oh no, wait, not that kind of DOS. Given how long tail my videos are, probably not even December, but anyway, the other kind of DOS. Chat about it for long enough and someone will end up saying, oh, good times, I remember creating a menu in AUTOEXEC.BAT so I could choose between enough memory to play adventure games with digitised sound or have my CD-ROM drive available, because apparently that was a choice. But why? Why did getting a game which required less than a megabyte to run need anyone to edit arcane configuration files on a PC with 4, 8 or even 16 megs of the stuff, when much later games with much more demanding system requirements would run just fine, as long as they weren't Quake on a 486. But why did you need to have not just memory, but conventional memory or EMS memory or XMS memory? Aren't they all just the same chips underneath? How can you have the wrong sort of memory? As with so many compromised elements of the PC, the answer lies with this box. The humble IBM 5150, a device which on some level every PC can still pretend to be. Yes, even modern CPUs. The boot sequence is quite something. IBM based the PC around Intel's 8088 CPU. This was because the PC design called for a specific niche of processor. It needed to be capable of addressing more memory than the 8-bit Z80 and 6502 processors most early personal computers were based around, but not so powerful it would hurt sales of IBM's professional products. Zilog's Z8000 was out due to political concerns, with owners Exxon building a competing personal computer. Texas Instruments' TS9900 didn't meet the technical requirements and involved too much lock-in to a single supplier. And while Motorola's 68000 chip was promising, it wouldn't be available in volume with a sufficient range of support chips quickly enough for IBM's schedule. So Intel, who were ready, became the preferred partner. Nervous about the high cost of a 16-bit expansion bus and internal political pressures about making the 5150 too powerful, the PC team picked the 8088 with its 8-bit data bus over the fully 16-bit 8086. Importantly, unlike the 64K limit of the Z80, 6502 and indeed TMS 9900, the 8088 supported a whole 1 megabyte of possible memory addresses. But how? It's not like the chips contained a line of code saying if memory address is less than 65536, then access. But let's take a look at a Z80. There are 8 pins for the chip to receive data from memory, D0 to D7, making up the 8-bit data bus. However, the system needs to know which memory address to get those 8 bits from. So making up the bulk of the 40 pins are 16 address lines. With 16 pins, i.e. bits, we can send any number from 0 to 65535, getting 64K of address space. But wait, you might ask. Wasn't there a 128K ZX Spectrum which used a Z80 with one of these 16-bit address bus things? Yes, there was, and oh does that start to make things fun. Hold that attribute clashing thought. The 8086 and 8088 use 20 pins for their address bus, which allows 16 times the number of possible addresses, and you might wonder how it does that and still fits into a 40-pin package, but Intel used a trick called address data multiplexing, where the same pins can be used to transmit either addresses or data. 8 of them in the 8088, 80 to 87, and 16 of them in the 8086. But despite this wider address space, Intel used 16-bit registers throughout the 8088, including the address register as an instruction pointer. So how do we not end up stuck using only 64K of memory, because we can only access it with a 16-bit register? By things getting complex. Horrible, and giving any vintage assembly programmer the shudders. See, on the 8088, addresses are built up from 2 registers, a segment register and an address register. But hang on a moment. Now we have 2 16-bit registers, so why isn't this now internally a 32-bit address space, regardless of how many address lines the CPU has? Well, segments overlap. Because this actually makes life easier for the programmer than having a hard boundary every 64K to deal with. And on the 8088, each segment refers to a 16-byte paragraph of memory, so addresses can overlap. 010 is the same address as 10. This fits neatly into the 20 bits available for memory addresses, as long as you don't ask too closely what exactly happens with segment FFFF. Positioned 16 bytes before the end of the 20-bit address space, with 64K of addresses allowed beyond it. Oh, for the late 1970s and a mere 20 pins of addressing, Intel went, just wrap it around. And so those addresses go back to the start of the address space. This sounds like the kind of thing which will be fun if anyone ever relies on that behaviour. That never happened in the history of the PC. Oh no. Before we worry about that, I've been careful to say address space here, and there's a reason for that. The same reason why we don't remember a much contested famous, may or may not have been said quote of 1024K ought to be enough for anyone. See, RAM isn't the only type of memory the CPU might need to read or write. The PC was anticipated to contain expansion ROMs to give it more capabilities, including the cassette basic ROM built into every early IBM model. Unlike 8-bit micros, the PC's display adapters also have their own memory. All of these needed to be mapped into the computer's address space so they could be used via memory-mapped I/O and, in the case of ROMs, have the CPU execute code directly from them, instead of pushing a single piece of data at a time using slower and clunkier port-mapped I/O. The question here for a system designer is how much space do you give over to system RAM, and how much do you give over for ROMs and that? After some discussion, IBM chose a 5-3 split, 640K for memory and 384K for stuff. Due to the design of the 8088, specifically where it started executing code after a reset, it made most sense for the stuff to sit at the top of the address range. IBM allowed for future expansion by starting stuff at A000 with 128K reserved for graphics memory, thinking about potential future high-resolution graphics cards, even though the base address for the MDA and CGA were both above this. This, more than anything, cast in stone that 640K barrier. See, because early PCs put the graphics memory there, early developers assumed, well, it would always be there. And once EGA arrived in 1984 and set the base address for its new mode at A000, it was done. Any PC which supported software hard-coded to the EGA would need to have a break-in memory at that address, 640K. Now, some early x86-based clone machines like the Tandy 2000 did move the graphics memory higher up, or allowed DOS to use everything up to the beginning of the CGA base address at 0x8000. And this gave more memory for well-behaved DOS programs, or those which only needed CGA, at the cost of compatibility with less well-behaved ones, and that's a problem. So, other than the RM Nimbus, which had a very specific UK educational niche, most of these flopped, because inability to run the complete library of PC software outweighed an extra couple of 100 kilobytes of contiguous memory, especially when 640K was still just about enough for anyone. Clone manufacturers had no choice but to fall in line with market expectations, and so most PCs ended up with the IBM layout. 128K of mapped graphics memory, starting 640K into the memory map. Yep, 640K. Not so much enough for anyone as just where anyone expects the graphics memory to be. You may also note that later graphics cards had more than 128K of memory. This stuff gets fun, but all of this was in the future, circa late 1981. For an early PC with at most 256K of memory and a mere 16K CGA, this worked. You had your conventional memory, the first segment of which was the low memory in which DOS lived. Then way above that was the upper memory area, or UMA, where you could assume graphics memory would always sit and write directly to it simply by using its address. It's all very programmable once you get over that segment thing, and that really is more a thing for reverse engineering than forward engineering. But system memory continued to increase until a fully loaded XT came with the full 640K allowed in the conventional memory area. This was a milestone IBM never expected to reach. The PC was supposed to test the waters to see if a personal computer would sell and act as a stepping stone to more serious computers, not become a record-selling product line in its own right, one so successful and long-running that they would need to worry about perfect backward compatibility, a lesson painfully learnt from the release of the PC Junior. And while an XT was still based on the good old 4.77 MHz 8088, Intel had been developing new processors even while IBM was readying the PC. By the time IBM's XT launched in March 1983, Intel's AUTOEXEC CPU had been on the market for just over a year. The 286 abandoned the dual-inline pin packaging for a new socketed form factor with pins galore, so it had a full 16-bit data bus, no more address data multiplexing, and now a 24-bit address bus, allowing up to 16 megabytes of address space. But what of that 1 megabyte layout with its curious loop? By the early 1980s, this one-to-one physical mapping between hardware addresses and addresses seen by software was considered a bit old hat. To make use of the then vast 16 meg address space, Intel included a protected mode on the 286 where applications would request 64K chunks of memory and the processor would decide where those came from, preventing programs from reading or overwriting memory they shouldn't, the cause of many a total system crash. Intel's expectation was that the new processor would launch a wave of new hardware platforms and operating systems, using these new features to allow multitasking. To keep compatibility with existing software targeting the 8088, they made the 286 start off in real mode, but once an operating system had moved to protected mode, there was no way to go back without resetting the CPU. And that was a reasonable assumption, if the 286 was going into completely new systems, and Based on 70s home computing ecosystem, that in itself was reasonable. New processors meant completely new platforms most of the time. But while a few 286 specific operating systems existed, such as a version of Microsoft's own Unix variant Xenix, they required software to be written again from scratch. And here is the problem. The PC was a success. It had a swathe of killer apps, from word processors to spreadsheets and the odd game. People buying IBM's brand new Model 5170 AT with its 286 processor would have a significant library of existing real mode software they wanted to run. And even when in protected mode, it was useful to be able to drop back to real mode briefly to access the functions provided by still very resolutely real mode DOS. So despite the 286's new protected mode capabilities and the availability of operating systems to take advantage of it, nearly all 286-based PCs ran in real mode DOS, with the same memory restrictions as the 8088, or almost the same. I will get to that. But this was a bit of a problem. The PC needed to run DOS, but it was also fast becoming clear that 640K wasn't enough for anyone, with the AT supporting memory expansion boards adding several megabytes of additional memory. And unfortunately, the first few of these failed, because while the memory might have been in there was no good way to use it. And that was a lot of money for something most of your applications would just ignore, unless they were specially coded for that particular expansion board. What was needed was some kind of standard everyone could agree on for how to both provide and access that memory. Lotus, Intel and Microsoft got together to form one. Bill Gates was apparently incensed by the inelegance of it, banging his fist on tables and calling it garbage, but he committed to do it anyway. A situation anyone who works in software will be all too familiar with. But what was it? And why did Gates consider it garbage? I may have asked you to hold a thought about how Sinclair could have produced a 128K Spectrum when the Z80 only supported 64K of address space. Well, those 16 address lines can only ask for 65536 unique locations, and like the PC, the ZX Spectrum reserves a portion of memory for ROMs. In this case, the first 16K, because the Z80 starts execution from address 0. But what if we added some way for the memory controller to choose where those requests went? You could have 64K of addresses in location A and 64K of addresses in location B. And it wouldn't be possible to read both at the same time, but you could choose between one or the other, as you please. So this is what the Spectrum 128 does. It allows swapping the top 16K of memory between 8 different banks, although some of those are duplicates of lower memory ranges, so there are only 5 unique ones. As Gates rightfully complained, it's not elegant, because you don't really have a 128K computer. You've got a series of different 48K computers you choose between at will, and hope you don't have the wrong one selected when you try to read data, or worse, jump code execution into it. Oh, and bank switching is also how 128K Spectrum swapped between the fancy menu and good old 48K Basic, by swapping in the appropriate ROM in the lowest 16K. This bank switching approach was the same one Lotus, Intel and Microsoft did for the LIM EMS standard, also known as expanded memory, a standard which both makers of expansion boards and software developers could adopt, and whatever the software, or the expansion board, you'd be able to use one with the other. EMS carved out a 64K segment in the 384K of upper memory area and switched pages of memory in and out of it, 16K at a time. This leads to the slightly weird thing that if you have a 1MB 286, a very common configuration by the end of the era, 3/8 of that memory are in fact above the 1MB real mode boundary and only accessible through this window. An option some earlier BIOSes forced you to enable manually, or even worse, didn't support moving a relatively odd amount of memory like 384K, only allowing you to use that extra RAM as 512K of conventional and 512K of extended, a particularly useless configuration given you were likely already needing the full 640K of conventional. EMS was followed in the late 80s by XMS, a more flexible standard which allowed mapping extended memory much more configurably, with variable lengths instead of 4 fixed pages of 16K, although there was a limit on how many pieces of memory you could map at the same time, before running out of handles. This worked by putting the processor into protected mode, accessing the memory you wanted, copying it somewhere in the UMA which would be visible to real mode, and then dropping back to that real mode. Of course, with no protected mode on the 8088, that meant no XMS for you. And on the 286, this required resetting the CPU and was painfully slow. Well, that is until Microsoft's HighMem.sys XMS driver started using an undocumented instruction called load all, to manipulate secret segment registers and allow the 286 to directly access memory beyond 1 megabyte, without that costly switch to and from real mode. But here we hit a new problem. Memory expansion hardware would often force you to choose between using it for EMS or XMS, and most motherboards from the late 286 era onward, with space for more than 640K, only supported XMS full stop. But developers kept using the old standard, such as the joy of standards, meaning you might not be able to get digitized speech in Wing Commander or texture mapping in Car and Driver, because while you had enough memory, it was the wrong sort. Also, texture mapping on a 286 was kind of ambitious, but that never stopped me. And one solution was to use an emulator, which would emulate EMS while using XMS behind the scenes. And this wasn't quite a perfect solution, as rather than EMS's instant switching in and out of banks, the emulator would have to copy memory in and out. So while there were a few rare EMS emulators for the 286, these were only useful for software which didn't do too much bank switching, and most of them only supported the 386 and upwards, including the famous M386. But even if you did have the right sort, EMS and XMS were still on some level the wrong sort of memory. Because you might have 4 megabytes of RAM installed, but you could only get at it a few kilobytes at a time, and you couldn't run code in it at all, due to the inability to jump to locations inaccessible in real mode. So while a game might be able to store some sound samples or some sprites in EMS or XMS, a lot of things still had to fit in that 640K of conventional memory. Worse, as the PC advanced, there were more pressures being exerted on that memory. Some of it would be taken to run DOS and any drivers you needed. And as PCs gained more capabilities, DOS got bigger, and the drivers started to mount up. Mice, sound cards, CD-ROM drives, and then network connections all required their own drivers. TSRs, terminate and stay resident programs, which carved themselves out a slice of memory so they could be called by interrupt handlers, the stay resident part of that. DOS had 2 files that controlled what would be loaded at boot time, config.sys and AUTOEXEC.BAT, and on a PC with plenty of hardware, these would be full of lines installing drivers, each of which would use up yet more of that precious conventional memory. Fill up your expansion bays and you could be looking at 400K or less once DOS had finished booting. And this was a problem, because DOS had to load programs into a contiguous run of memory. It couldn't split them around that big chunk of graphics memory everyone expected to live at 640K, which meant everything had to fit below that barrier. This meant that coming into the peak of the home 16-bit era, a fully loaded PC could equal or even eclipse a 16-bit home micro or console in terms of raw power, but gained a reputation as an obtuse and ornery thing to get games running on, with this being a frequent message. While 1985's AUTO386 processor finally had a decent protected mode which allowed accessing all installed memory using simple linear 32-bit addressing and easily dropping back to real mode, high prices and slow adoption meant that, even by 1993, a large part of the install base were still on 286 machines, and you'd have to be a maniac to release a game which wouldn't run on real mode DOS. But operating system developers were eyeing that upper memory area closely, an upper memory area which had grown by 64K since the 8088, give or take 16 bytes. And this might seem utterly bizarre, but there's a good reason for it. Remember good old segment FFFF? Because the 286 had that 24-bit address bus, it didn't need to wrap addresses at 1 megabyte. So it didn't. Indeed, the last segment extended into extended memory, producing a new area called the HMA, or High Memory Area. And this non-wrapping of addresses was great, until you encountered some old software which assumed PCs did indeed wrap memory at the 1 megabyte boundary. The solution was something called the A20 gate. When opened, this would cut off the 21st address line, A20, from the rest of the motherboard, causing memory addresses to wrap again. Because even if an address was large enough to set a 1 on A20, the memory controller wouldn't see it. It was a physical gate, attached to the keyboard controller, because PCs. Weird. But if A20 could be used, this gave a useful extra slightly less than 64K, which could be accessed in real mode. Operating system developers noticed this. In 1990, Digital Research launched DR-DOS 5, which came with the capability to load parts of the operating system into the HMA. Here is the origin of that mysterious DOS equals high incantation in your config.sys. But this wasn't the only thing Digital Research did with memory addresses above 640K. A20 aside, the 384K upper memory area had a lot of unused space in it. Either space which was never used, or space which had been used for things like cassette basic ROMs, which a PC with drives both floppy and hard, as would have been common by the 90s, had no need of. It might not have been useful for loading big programs which needed hundreds of kilobytes of memory, but it could be useful for loading device drivers, which were small. On a FreeXC, DRDOS could use a memory manager called M386 to load those device drivers into the UMA. M386 was well known as an EMS emulator, but being a full expanded memory manager, its ability to map free areas of the UMA with XMS could just as effectively be used to place device drivers into them, which also meant regular programs didn't have to fiddle about with that tricky area of memory and whether it corresponded to actual RAM or not. Earlier attempts to provide more memory in real mode, as we saw with those failed clones, had tried things like using unused portions of graphics memory to extend that contiguous region of memory available to DOS, but this was less viable with EGA and VGA using most of that space, and it also added a lot of complexity. It really was far better for DOS to get out of the way and let programs use the conventional memory that freed up, since they already knew what to do with it. Remember that while these addresses were in theory reserved, in practice they were part of the real mode address space, and thus code could be executed from there, just as it could from any other part of real mode memory, providing that memory didn't correspond to a hardware device. Even if it did in some cases, yes, you can run code from your graphics card's internal memory if you find some way to put it there, and don't mind the result being both visible on screen and very slow. Still, normally you wouldn't. You'd want to put things in the holes, and this was the origin of DOS's DOS equals UMB incantation, telling DOS to manage those upper memory blocks. DRDOS 5 was one of many salvos in the DOS wars of the early 90s, which would be fought in increasingly underhand fashion until Microsoft froze out third-party DOS providers with Windows 95, and with that effectively extinguished all non-Microsoft DOS on the PC, even if doing so generated a hefty lawsuit that they later settled out of court. I really should cover the DOS wars one of these days. One of the key features DOS makers would use to claim that their DOS was the best was how much conventional memory was left free once the command prompt came up, often over 620K for later versions of both DR and MS-DOS. On DRDOS 5, the end user had to identify areas of UMA which were likely to be free and point the operating system at them. Microsoft's response, MS-DOS 5, did this automatically. A user would still need to figure out the correct sequence of commands and what order to load things in, carefully rebooting and running the mem command until they found a maximum. But the work of where those things went could be done by the OS and didn't require the highly prized, difficult skill of memory mapping. MS-DOS 6, while it may have increased the level of underhandedness in the DOS wars, particularly in relation to drive compression programs, also introduced a new tool for automating this process. MemMaker would handle the process of juggling around device drivers, figuring out what could fit where in the UMA, and leave the user with the maximum possible amount of conventional memory free. The problem with all this juggling is not all programs liked it. I covered how some relied on the A20 gate, but esoteric memory managers like Ultima 7s didn't play nicely with system memory managers like M386, which worked at a very low level, putting 386 and later processors in their virtual 8086 mode. Some games refused to run if EMS was present, while others demanded it be there. A few even took issue with having so much conventional memory, deciding that if the first 64K was not full, then DOS had ceased to exist, and it really wasn't reasonable for a program to run in such a deep state of philosophical crisis. The solution for many people was the boot disk, a floppy disk with a specially tuned config.sys and AUTOEXEC.BAT, intended to get one or more particularly recalcitrant games to run. Or, if you were really fancy, a boot menu, because DOS allowed you to set up menu options in config.sys and AUTOEXEC.BAT, which would allow you to write multiple different configurations and choose between them at boot time. Yes, I had one of these. Of course I had one of these. But by the time I had one of those, DOS 6.22, I was only doing this to run old games. Retro gaming before it was cool. You know? Because DOS 6.22 released in June 1994, and by that point we were well into the breakneck evolution of hardware which saw games go from running on a reasonably fast 286 to requiring a Pentium MMX with 3D card over the space of about 5 years. And while mid-1994 was only a little way into that, even 386s were becoming obsolete, and the 486 was being treated as the baseline for a gaming system, meaning games now started with the iconic 2 lines of DOS gaming. What is DOS 4GW? Well, it's a DOS extender, which allows real-mode DOS to run programs in protected mode, with all memory available to a program using 32-bit linear addressing. In other words, providing there's enough memory to start the extender, conventional memory doesn't matter. And a whole era of hand-tuning boot configurations to free up the right sort of memory in the right place was swept away with it. Instead, we replaced it with getting your SVGA card to work. But between this easier memory situation and the rise of middleware such as Miles Sound System and UniVBA VESA drivers, this was the start of one of the most glorious aspects of the 486 era. PC games which just worked. Well, unless smart drive's stolen 2 megs to create a disk cache. Or you've got particularly esoteric hardware. Or you're an early adopter of 3D graphics card. Or your graphics card isn't actually supported by UniVBE. You know, what we used to call good times. I think. Bye.